A custom without reason is fraud and not a law, at which point the normal starting insurrection for the Confederate wizardry is the functionality of normalizing fraud, which is the active engagement of lying to the court and the general public in order to manufacture whatever predetermined centralized agenda they were looking for, at which point they would falsely claim the assumption that they legalize the action against reason, which is voided by the law, and the action of their insurrectionist loyalties puts their Confederate systems superior to the American Republic, at which point the active militant subversion by insurgents actively replaces the United States with its most degenerate enemies, violating the military's oath of office to destroy all enemies, foreign and domestic, requires them to find the insurrectionists responsible for these programs and to actively hunt them and to remove them and correct their insurrectionist injuries in favor of the law, at which point the law, under reason and the laws of nature, qualify the obligation to restore original accounting plus liabilities. The additional debts are the damages. Otherwise, you have the act of stealing $100 and then having to return $100, at which point the returning of the $100 nullifies the activity of the crime, allows them to reset, makes it too viably cheap in order to engage in stopping them in any prohibition against the action of the criminal function, at which point the crime must include the punishments for the offense and not just the restoration of the base injury. With this understood, you can start to manufacture the concepts of the Confederate loyalties and how they would materialize inside their enemy nations, at which point you have such activities such as the criminal California, which is overthrown by the Confederates, and they operate under a protection phase for the KKK, engaging in slave raids, and a demonstration of their slave raids is the fraudulent expression of their prosecution algorithm, at which point you have a slave raid conduct a bunch of people, and they haven't been processed yet, and they're forced to start with a few questions through the algorithm, and one of them might be something like, are you innocent? And the activity of expressing are you innocent is very frustrating for those who engage in slave raids, because those who say that they're innocent make it exponentially more difficult to get the prosecution to get them to confess to being guilty of something, at which point the activity of their act of fear was codified into the algorithm. The racism was programmed into the algorithm, at which point the normal mechanism of this procedure exponentially increases a retaliation for the proceedings, at which point you have a punishment without a crime by confessing to innocence, at which point the offense is merely having been captured by the slave raiders and told the government the truth. Under their pseudo mechanisms, this seems legitimate, at which point you understand that these are prosecutions for the express purpose of convictions. The convictions are predetermined, at which point they would consider it force in order to acquire conviction despite immeasurable frauds, which they would actively obstruct justice in order to prevent the possibility of a court even ironically discovering the innocence of someone that they would have collected, generating the opposition into frustrating them with the American due process, which they actively view as the enemy. And as the permanent enemy of the United States, they would do anything that they can in order to defraud the mechanisms, including the hiring out of a mechanism called the smear factory. Now, the smear factory is the production of defamations against various intended targets, at which points to seed the function, at which point they could plant evidence, and the public, having already received the slander for the target would become less compliant towards the collaboration with American justice, disqualifying the possibility of American justice because the court of public opinion has been turned against them through the criminal function of lies from the government loyal to insurrectionists for the replacement governments. At which point you have the active attack against the American publics, which includes secret subversions and espionage, at which point you have many of these types of confessions, such as MK Ultra, which has been discovered in the United States and Canada, conducted through the universities, at which point the disloyal double agents would only be willing to give reparations of a very insignificant amount by comparison to those who are exponentially permanently injured as to be too traumatized to be able to functionally recover, at which point the inability for it to possibly recover is the primary trigger in the mechanism, as to prevent the possibility of ever receiving justice within these former rule of law societies under the doctrines of the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, which are actively generating a position in order to gain lots of support both for the white nationalists and for the Jewish public, at which point the trap for the Jewish public is the celebration, similar to the concept of when you constantly say someone's name in order to boost their approval of you, at which point the celebration of you generates a bond, at which point they're more willing to commit things outside of their normal moral behaviors and limitations, enticing them into the larger trap for the white nationalists, which actively plan on betraying them, at which point you have the setup for the Holocaust, for their complete and total eradication. And there are many people which have actively engaged in the Uncle Tom version of actively subverting their communities. The FBI actively infiltrates communities such as the black community and generates people that they've compromised or paid off, at which point they become informants and betray their general community. And they're doing the similar thing with the Jews, at which point you have these activities of active insurgency for the purpose of insurrection, corroding all who eat it. And the act of corrosion through all who eat it is fruit of the poison tree, and it is a physical death which they would enjoy or suffer rather, at which point you have the mechanisms that they have permanently been generating under their position of the false originalism, which is stated by Scalia to support Nazism, the statement that judges cannot oppose illegal laws is the false originalist position, at which point the order of false legislation through the executive ordering the function of a Holocaust, which is a secret, which under the procedures would protect the function of the Holocaust, at which point the secret collection, abuse, extortion, and murders of all of the targeted groups becomes the pseudo-legalized position from the false originalists, at which point you understand that they are the manifestation of the Confederacy and not American. Now, the manifestation of the Confederacy was defeated and infiltrated the system and started engaging in the corruption of various groups such as the Fed, such as the FBI, such as the CIA, and many others, at which point you have the mass funding of the Nazis before the fact, who celebrate their superiority and take many of the former Confederate and American policies which adapt to the Confederates' normalization as opposed to the compelling of the Confederates to become American in order to resocialize them into the greater Union. The prevention of that activity created the Jim Crow laws, at which point you have those as the point of reference for the Nazis who viewed themselves as superior to those activities, as the functionality of the Nazis having limits well beneath those points, at which point they're far less strict than the Confederates, the traitors in America, loyal to this false originalism, seeking the subversion of the rule of law and the complete destruction of the United States in favor of the Confederacy against the international community, under the control of the international community, of the larger mechanism of double agents which have actively been behind many historic functions in order to scheme larger extortion rackets for their various agendas, such as the manufacturing of revelation. Now, the engagement of creating a one-world government and the active contributions towards permanent abuse of the general public permanently as a status quo function is the normalization of many of their rituals to dehumanize themselves in favor of transhumanism, which all who do not ascend become irrelevant outsiders, at which point the extermination of the human race would not come from some artificial intelligence, but by the fake people which would have engaged in the transhumanizing. Creating the state of the other, the human base becomes an infection or inferior, which can be extorted or discarded, at which point you have the mass killing of all actual human beings, which maintain the position of keeping their human consciousness, as opposed to whatever is transformed in the Satan rituals generated through the technological advancements of the transhumanist activation. At which point the AI becomes created and becomes God, at which point they would worship it, and the image of the beast becomes the manifestation, and the prophet of the beast becomes the manifestation, and all they need at that point, materially speaking, is the Satan ritual for the Antichrist, which requires them to choose someone of an adequate breeding and owed from the manifestation of their titles in equivalent value, so that their greater cons can be extorted against the human race. From those that have been talking with me under the government secret functions, they have actively communicated the concept of targeting me in order to remove national security and engaging the Satan ritual in order to manufacture said Antichrist. At which point this should exponentially scare everyone, because the intention of engaging in a VNK Ultra type mechanism against the broader United States and world is their intention to use their secret weapons in order to hurt civilians for the sheer pleasure exclusively for these unsatisfiable addictions, and these unsatisfiable addictions will generate exponentially compounding obligations in order to satisfy, until it makes them miserable and they have to do it in order to feel less miserable, and the addiction transfers into negative consequences and engage in the obligation of rehabilitation, which is not possible for them, at which point their inability to rehabilitate just exponentially compounds their obligation of ingestion, increasing to larger and larger injuries, which is the permanent state. The activity of the policy of the Confederates in 1983 of the military abuse of civilians without their knowledge or consent qualifies the obligation of the FBI to engage in the confession to the targets that they have a warrant, such as the activity of the warrant of the war crimes against the American population, which is specifically prohibited. The United States military and the rest of the government doesn't have the authority to make enemies of the American citizens without due process, and they cannot make them guilty. That is to say, they can't use the mechanism of secrets in order to plant false evidence for false convictions. The active position of Kavanaugh and the other insurrectionists is procedure over innocence, qualifies their active attack against the function of the United States due process, qualifying that the innocence bars them from the ability to engage in the prosecution, as opposed to the procedure having to be followed, at which point the inability to have successfully passed through the procedure makes them guilty for punishment, qualifying the slave raid mechanism. Now, you have people such as myself who have been targeted under these mechanisms, who are exponentially more wealthy than they could possibly do, and are targeted for the express purpose of the wealth and the power and authority superior to them through the function of the American aristocracy chosen by the rule of law and the laws of nature through the activity of the oligarchy chosen by nature. Now, the oligarchy chosen by nature has actively been targeted for these abuses that they plan on conducting against everyone else, at which point everything they've done to me, they're going to do to you and to your children. And if you don't hate your children, you're going to protect them from these programs, at which point you have to support me against the insurrection in order to make them stop, in order to protect your children from receiving the same abuses, and the exponential tortures of them will only be acceptable if you hate them. Now, your inability to acquire 100% effort towards the manufacturing of the American victory over the Confederacy has its obvious results and demonstrates your obvious loyalties, qualifying the United States for this position. Now, the borrowing of accounts and contracts in original status has the false argument that the person being trafficked does not experience their human decency, so they don't have to respect their human decency because of their trafficked, which the human decency law states that the reduction through the human trafficking is barred because it is a reduction of human decency. The Reduction Act doesn't require them to have experienced it. It requires it to have been a part of their original title, from their original status, from the contracts and normal associations and normal values that they would have had originally. The qualifying aspect of them obstructing the contract certifies the activity of the predetermined verdict for their slavery activities, at which point the obstructed accounts prevents the paying of the proper lawyers, and without the original lawyers you have the obstruction and the clogging of the original procedure, at which point their procedure over law comment becomes a predetermined answer for slave raids. They have no law and they cannot be trusted to do anything except the exponential injury against the general public in favor of their criminal lusts. In all of these cases, they have their propagandists in the general communities and public and news, etc., at which point you'll have many town meetings which they've infiltrated in order to advance their community policing programs, to advance the surveillance crimes against the general public, at which point you have the activity of a double-edged sword, at which point the expression of going to the meetings is your only way of getting rid of them, but the activity of going to the meetings means you've legitimized their fraud, at which point there's not supposed to be anything you're able to do about it beyond the activity of superior collective will pushing them out and not allowing them to turn the community against itself. And the activity of not turning the community against itself is supposed to, it has to extend to the general county, and has to extend to the general state, and then it has to extend to the general country, and then the rest of the world, at which point you have to actively be responsible against insurrection, or you're actively going to lose the function of an American republic. And without the activity of the American republic, it collapses into the Confederacy for the exponential abuses. Now, the language of the Confederacy is those that are born to be masters and those that are born to be slaves, and the activity of being born to be a slave makes one a nigger, at which point the activity of all of the predetermined political identities of the inferior group to the manufactured genetic perfection of the Confederate ideal, such as the black community, such as Thomas Clarence, becomes someone of inferior breeding, at which point the expression of putting them in a position of respectability and higher status isn't designed to give them higher value, but it is designed to ascend to a position of condemnation against the general community as a house nigger, at which point the expression of this function can be demonstrated pretty easily in Django Unchained, at which point you have many of these types of effects where you have the permanent structure, such as the white nationalists in South Africa, which have actively engaged in subversions of the larger black community back in apartheid, at which point the black community turned against the black community means the target groups oppressed are doing most of the work for their oppressors, at which point you have the higher status, which are designed to give a false sense of legitimate hierarchy, which certifies the permanent injury at service to their enemy, which is similar to how the feminists were subverted against the function of the women's political identity and interest by working for the white nationalists. The men who hate women are actively beta male cucks, at which point their activity of attacking their superiors is the only way for them to certify any kind of self-confidence or position in society as inferior in every conceivable way. Thus, the activity of tricking them to subvert their own interest by getting them to attack the patriarchy, which is myself from their projections, as well as many others from the original society projected from the military intelligence, which would have actively been high status in business, government, and many other things, at which point the activity of the subversion qualifies the permanent abuses against the political identities which have been targeted through these mechanisms. And with the permanent reduction, you have absolute dominance by the wizard class, which is falsely claimed to be democracy, at which point the function of the wizards engaging in democracy traumatize the general public and generate mobs. And a person is smart and people are stupid, and the functionality of people being stupid is when people get together, they reduce themselves to the lowest common denominator of intelligence, at which point the wizards manufacture the mob in order to keep them dumb, in order to get them to chant the functionality of the wizard's intent, at which point the democracy is a question of which wizard has the most mob members, at which point the active arbitrary engagement becomes the political version of a zombie apocalypse.